A poor girl pleaded. "Please don't take my home," the rich rancher said. "Then you must be my wife." Texas, 1876. The courthouse of a sun-drenched frontier town stood crooked and faded, like the memory of law itself. Inside, the air was dry and heavy. Lori Mayfield stood alone at the center of the room, her back straight, fists clenched tight around a sheaf of damp, crumpled documents. Land records, planting logs, receipts in her father's hand. Her voice had already been heard, her case already weighed. The judge lifted his gavel and looked down over his spectacles. Without a formal deed, no matter the years of use or improvement, the land is not legally hers. It is considered vacant property. The gavel struck. "This land shall be annexed to the adjacent Boone Ranch holdings." Gasps, some mutters, a few long stares. Lori didn't blink, she didn't cry, she didn't look back. Her nails bit into her palms so hard they bled, but she didn't flinch. Outside, the wind kicked up grit. Her boots crunched over gravel as she crossed the street to where her horse waited. Voices chased her down the boardwalk like old ghosts. She should have married by now, too proud, too stubborn. Fool girl, trying to hold land like a man. But Lori only climbed into the saddle, lips thin, jaw set. That land was where her father died with his boots on, where her mother's grave rested beneath the pear tree, where her hands bled over spring plowing. It wasn't property, it was memory. It was home. By dusk, she rode to the wrought iron gate of Boone Ranch. The horizon flared crimson as if the sun were bleeding out. A man stood in the yard, calm and alone, reloading his rifle with practiced, quiet hands. Thatcher Boone, the richest landowner in the county, a man raised hard and sharp, like the hills. He didn't look surprised to see her, just studied her under the brim of his hat. "You here to ask for your land back?" he asked, voice low and even. Lori sat stiff in the saddle. Her voice was not strong, but it was clear. "Please don't take my home." A long silence. Thatcher didn't smile, didn't mock, just looked at her like she was a riddle in the dust. Her dress was threadbare, her boots patched, her eyes, though, clear as melted ice and just as cold. He'd seen tears before, on prettier women, heard pleas. But this wasn't that. Lori wasn't begging. She was fighting for her life with the last weapon she had. Dignity. He said, "The only way for you to stay on that land is if it belongs to you." He took a slow step forward. "And the only way for it to belong to you is if it belongs to my wife." Another pause. Then, "So, marry me. You stay. That's the deal." Lori blinked. "Marry?" Her voice cracked like a whip. The word felt like a slap. "I'm not a trade. I'm not some tool you use to fix your border lines." "I'm not marrying for love," Thatcher replied evenly. "I'm marrying because you're the first person I've met who'd rather starve than lie." Lori stared. His eyes didn't flicker. She turned to leave, rage buzzing under her skin, but so did helplessness. She had no lawyer, no money, no rights. Her house would be torn down before the week's end. The field she had planted would be turned by someone else's mule. And somehow, this man, this cold, blunt man, was offering her something no one else had, a choice. She looked over her shoulder. "Fine, I marry you, but I stay on my land, and I stay me. No arguments here." By the next morning, they stood side by side in the mayor's office. A hastily prepared marriage license lay on the desk. A deputy served as witness. There were no flowers, no rings, no kisses. Just ink, paper, and silence. Two names joined, two strangers bound. Not by romance, not yet. But by something even rarer on the frontier, respect. The sun had not yet burned the morning frost off the grass when Lori stepped back across the threshold of her father's house. It stood exactly as she had left it, stubborn against time and wear. The front steps still creaked, the roof still sagged, and the air still smelled of dry earth and old wood. She let her fingers brush the worn doorframe as she entered, as if to reassure herself that it had not been a dream. She had married a man she barely knew just to keep this place. Thatcher had not argued. He had signed a separate contract, in ink and dignity, that stated plainly the house and land Laurie lived on would be recognized as a distinct portion within Boone territory. Her name was on it, not as a wife, not as a dependent, but as a steward. It was quiet, thoughtful, and binding. He had not said anything poetic about it, but she saw the respect in that silence. 2 days after the wedding, a man arrived with a toolbox and a pack mule. "Boone sent me," he said, tipping his hat. "Said the roof needs patching and the stovepipes bent." Laurie crossed her arms. "I did not ask for help." He scratched his neck. He said it was in the agreement. When she confronted Thatcher about it, he stood on her porch, unreadable. "You put that in the contract?" "Yes, you're not doing this alone." She stared at him. "I've been doing it alone for years." "And it nearly cost you everything." Laurie held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned inside. She did not slam the door, but she did not invite him in either. The work continued. She accepted only what was necessary. If the stovepipe collapsed, she let it be fixed. If the barn door fell off its hinge, she did not say no to a replacement. But the fields, the garden, the animals, those she tended herself. She drew lines, and Thatcher, to his credit, did not step over them. Until the matter of the well. It was midweek when she saw him there, stripped down to his undershirt and boots, dirt streaked along his forearms. He had been digging since dawn. The old well was too shallow, the water turning brackish. She had mentioned it offhand. Now he was 2 feet down, swinging a pick like any other hired hand. She approached, hesitant. "You didn't have to. You need clean water," he said simply. Then he struck the earth again. She stood there a moment, watching the rhythm of his work. It was strange to see a man who owned more acres than she could count, kneeling in her yard like it meant something. Later that day, the sun was heavy and hot, pressing down from a cloudless sky. Laurie carried a tin cup of water, still cool from the spring, and stepped carefully toward the well. She did not want to admit how often she had checked the window while he worked. But as she approached the edge, her boot slipped. The dirt crumbled under her. In an instant, she tipped forward. Before panic could even rise in her chest, arms closed around her. The impact never came. She felt the thud of another body cushioning her fall. The world righted itself, and she was not in the well, but pressed against his chest, one of his hands gripping her back. Their faces were close, her breath caught. His eyes were darker up close, shadowed but steady. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. She nodded, barely. He lifted her with ease, one arm behind her knees, and carried her back toward the house. Neither spoke. At the door, he set her down gently, his fingers lingering just a moment too long. She said nothing, neither did he. But when he walked away, Laurie touched her chest, startled by how fast her heart was still racing. That night, she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. The wind moved through the eaves. Somewhere outside, the well was deeper, safer. She did not sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because, for the first time, she did not feel entirely alone in the house her father built. The storm had not given warning. One moment, the air was thick with spring humidity. The next, it broke open, with wind and cold rain that lashed the earth like punishment. Laurie had stayed out too long that night, her coat soaked through, dragging burlap to cover the young corn she had planted only days before. It was not enough. The water had come anyway, rising over her boots, biting into her skin. She did not stop until her fingers were too numb to tie knots. The next morning, she did not rise. When Thatcher arrived, the front door was ajar. The house was quiet, too quiet, save for the soft sound of wind pressing against the shutters. He stepped inside, calling her name. No answer. In the corner of the room, he found her curled under a threadbare quilt, cheeks pale, sweat shining on her brow. He did not speak. He simply knelt, reached out, and felt the heat burning off her skin. He stoked the fire first. Then he boiled water, mixed herbs, found the small tin of tea she kept near the window. He wrapped a scarf around her neck, added another blanket, and sat beside her. She did not stir. That night, he stayed. He had not planned to. He had only meant to check in, to make sure she was safe. But her breathing was uneven, her hands too cold, her pulse shallow under her skin. He cooked oatmeal and forced her to sip from a spoon. When she coughed, he held the basin. When she shivered, he rubbed her hands between his own until her fingers curled slightly, instinct clinging to warmth. On the second night, the fever deepened. She muttered nonsense under her breath, names he did not recognize, her father's, perhaps. Memories slipped loose under the weight of the fever. Thatcher sat in the wooden chair beside her bed, boots still on, hands folded. Every few minutes he would rise, place another log in the stove, adjust the blanket, press a damp cloth to her forehead. The moon rose, full and clear outside the frosted window. He fell asleep holding her hand. Lori stirred, not fully waking, but enough to notice the weight against her palm. Her eyes opened slightly, unfocused, then fixed on the man slouched beside her bed, head bowed. He was asleep, lips parted just slightly, hair a mess over his forehead. His thumb rested along the side of her hand, not squeezing, just there. She whispered, barely audible, "You weren't supposed to care." Thatcher did not open his eyes. "I didn't plan to, but I do." Nothing more was said. The morning light broke cold and clear across the floorboards. Lori woke to the scent of broth and the sound of boots pacing. Her body ached, but the fever had lifted. She pushed the blanket back and sat up slowly. He was by the stove, stirring something in a pot. When he turned, his face lit with quiet relief. "You're awake," he said. "I am." She tried to thank him, but he shook his head. No need, no debt. Later that morning she cooked breakfast for the both of them. Just eggs and toast, but she had not cooked for anyone since her father passed. She set the table without saying a word, and nodded for him to sit. They ate slowly, quietly. A few glances passed between them, unsure and heavy, but not uncomfortable. At one point, he reached for the butter and said her name without thinking. "Lori." She looked up. "Thank you," he added. She did not ask for what, she only smiled slightly and passed him the jam. That morning the house felt different, warmer somehow, more lived in. They no longer called each other Boone and Miss Mayfield. The titles had fallen away, replaced by something unnamed, something quieter, but growing. Neither spoke of the night before. Neither called it anything more than what it was. But neither of them forgot. The golden light of late autumn spread across the Boone estate like warm honey, sliding over the fence posts and catching on the tips of wheat-colored grass. Trees swayed in shades of fire, leaves rustling like whispered secrets. The air carried the crisp warning of winter, sharp against the skin, but softened by the smell of burning wood from distant chimneys. It was the kind of evening that settled into bones, quiet and unforgettable. Preparations had begun early for the annual harvest gathering, a long-standing tradition among the ranchers of the county. Each year, it marked the end of labor and the beginning of long, dark months ahead. There would be food, music, and drink enough to forget the calluses on every hand. Thatcher Boone had not attended in years. Not since his parents died, not since the gatherings had felt more like performance than community. But this time, he planned to go. And he would not go alone. He rode to Lori's cabin just before sunset. The orange sky stretched behind him as he crested the ridge. Lori was outside, stacking firewood along the side of the house, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back. Her movements were precise, rhythmic, like everything she did with her hands. When she noticed him dismounting, her brow furrowed. He wore a clean white shirt under a dark vest, and his boots had been polished to a mirror shine. His hair had clearly been combed with effort, though a single rebellious strand still fell across his brow. In his arm, draped neatly, was a soft gray shawl. Lori raised one eyebrow, suspicious. "No." He didn't flinch. "I'm not a decoration," she said flatly, brushing dirt from her fingers. "I didn't say you were." He stood there quietly, not blocking her path, not insisting, just waiting. His posture was relaxed but intentional, like a man who had come not to argue, but to offer something unspoken. When she didn't move, he said gently, "I'm not asking you to impress anyone. Just stand beside me, for tonight." The words sank in. They carried no pressure, only quiet sincerity. Laurie exhaled slowly, then reached for the shawl without looking at him. The main house glowed with lantern light. From the porch came the steady rhythm of a fiddle and banjo trading notes like old friends. The packed dirt of the yard had become a dance floor, boots pounding in time with laughter and clapping hands. Inside, long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, baked pies, and jugs of sweet cider that glowed like amber in the light. When Thatcher entered with Laurie, conversation dipped. Eyes followed them, some curious, some surprised, some calculating. Laurie stood tall in a plain blue dress, and her everyday boots, still dusted with earth. She did not offer a smile. She made no attempt to charm. But her chin was high, and her gaze steady. She did not look away. Thatcher never strayed from her side. He introduced her once. "This is my wife." The room took note. Older ranchers nodded at her with the kind of acknowledgement that came from recognizing grit. But not every glance was kind. Evelyn Carr, wrapped in lace and practiced malice, approached with a smile that curled like a snake. Marriage of convenience never looked so rustic. Laurie's hand tightened at her side. Before she could speak, Thatcher's fingers slid into hers, steadying. "She's my wife," he said evenly, his voice clear and unshakable, "and that's the most convenient truth I've ever lived." The room shifted. Evelyn blinked, her smile cracking at the edges. She retreated. Laurie looked up at him. "You didn't have to say that. I know." They danced once, slow, a little stiff. Neither knew the steps well, but they stayed close, and that was enough. On the ride home, the prairie lay quiet beneath the moonlight. The wind tugged gently at her hair. She said nothing, but her heart beat too fast. This was not part of the agreement. And yet, something in her had leaned in. Something in her had wanted to be defended, wanted to be seen. She stared ahead at the soft flicker of the cabin window in the distance. Hope, she realized, was not always gentle. Sometimes it arrived with fear. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the front windows of Laurie's cabin, catching dust motes in its path. She was sorting through the pile of old books her father had left behind, trying to decide which could be salvaged for the new shelf she planned to build. The room smelled of cedar, old paper, and faintly of smoke from the morning's fire. She lifted a cracked, leather-bound journal, and a folded sheaf of paper fell out, tucked deep between the pages. She bent to retrieve it. Her hands stilled as her eyes traced the heading at the top of the page. Draft Contract Marriage Settlement Proposal. The name of the attorney was clear. The date was 2 weeks before the court hearing. She read. Her heart beat louder with every line. Proposed arrangement allows Mr. Boone to retain ownership of disputed land through marital union. Agreement to be dissolved post-harvest without penalty. No obligation of cohabitation. Purpose strictly legal. The words blurred. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, still gripping the page. Her thumb left a crease near the signature line. A sharp breath escaped her lips, but she didn't cry. She didn't have the strength. She read the last line again. Purpose strictly legal. She folded the page back, then unfolded it again, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. Even knowing what they were from the beginning, even walking into this marriage with her eyes wide open, she had let herself believe. Believe in a man who worked beside her, stood beside her, held her when she fell, sat at her table, who looked at her as though she was more than a solution. She stood up, took the paper, and walked out into the yard. Thatcher arrived at dusk. She was waiting for him on the porch, arms crossed, no fire in her voice, just cold clarity. This is what it was all along? He paused. What are you talking about? She threw the folded draft at his boots. He bent down, picked it up, unfolded it. Recognition flickered across his face. Then silence. "So, I'm just your legal loophole?" Her voice cracked only once. He looked up at her. "That's what it started as." "That's not an answer." He stepped forward. "It started as that. But it didn't stay that way." She shook her head. "You should have told me." "You wouldn't have said yes." "No," she agreed, "but at least I wouldn't have started to hope." He looked away. "I thought, when you stayed during my sickness, when you took my hand at the dance, I thought maybe it meant something." "It did," he said quietly. "Then why not tell me the truth?" "I didn't want to lose what we were building." Lori stepped back. Her voice was flat. "You already have." She turned and walked into the house. Thatcher followed to the door, but didn't cross the threshold. "I didn't plan to care," he said, "but I do. And not because you're my wife on paper, because you're the strongest damn person I've ever known, because I look forward to hearing your voice in the morning, because I forgot what it felt like to build something real." She didn't answer. He stepped back. "I'll leave you be." When the sound of his boots faded into silence, Lori stood alone in the doorway. Her hands trembled, not from anger, from the ache of almost. She walked to the chest at the end of her bed, opened the lid, and pulled out the simple cotton dress she'd worn the day they signed the papers. She lit a match. The flames caught quickly, curling the edges of fabric like autumn leaves. She didn't watch it burn. But long after the last thread turned to ash, the smoke still clung to the rafters. And her silence. The wind had picked up by dusk. The first snow of the season came early, as if the sky itself had grown impatient. Thick flakes swept down over the mountains, turning the trail into a white blur of silence. Lori pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared at the dying fire in the stone hearth of the cabin her father once built. The roof still held, barely, and the windows were nothing but gaps between planks. But it was hers. It had been his. And tonight it was enough. She sat cross-legged on the floor, wrapped in blankets, cradling her father's old notebook. The pages were yellowed, ink faded, but his handwriting remained steady and bold. Planting seasons, measurements, doodles of fence posts, and scribbled in the margins, notes of pride. Lori held the hammer straight today. She learned to measure without the stick. She'll outwork any man. She closed the book, hugged it to her chest, and closed her eyes. Below, on the trail winding through snow-dusted pine, Thatcher Boone gripped the reins tight, his horse panting through the climb. He had searched the house, the barn, the fields. She was nowhere. But he knew her, enough to guess where she would go when the world grew too heavy. Somewhere old, somewhere untouched. He saw the smoke first, thin and struggling. Then the roofline. He dismounted and ran the last stretch on foot, boots crunching in the frozen grass. He pushed the door open without knocking. There she was, pale, curled in blankets, shivering even by the fire. Her eyes fluttered open. He knelt beside her. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, voice raw. "And you shouldn't be up here alone in a storm." She coughed, pulling the blanket tighter. "I didn't think it'd snow." "I know." She looked down, ashamed of the tears threatening in her eyes. "You lied to me." "I did," he said, without flinching. "And I hate myself for it." He reached for another log and fed it to the fire. "But I didn't come here to explain. I came because I won't let you be alone in this storm." She said nothing. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he added, eyes on the flames. "I just want you to stay warm. That's all tonight needs to be." He moved to the far side of the cabin, pulled off his coat, and spread it on the floor. Lori's voice was barely a whisper. "You came all this way?" "Yes." "In the snow?" "Yes." She held the notebook tighter. "I wanted to feel like I was still his daughter," she said, "not just someone's contract." Thatcher lay back against the floorboards, folding his arms behind his head. "You are," he murmured. "You always will be." For a long time, only the sound of crackling wood and distant wind filled the cabin. Lori closed her eyes. She didn't ask him to hold her, didn't ask him to stay. But he did. Quietly. Completely. And as the night wore on and the fire burned low, the storm outside raged on without them. But inside, for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. The morning after the storm was impossibly still. Snow blanketed the world outside the cabin, soft and glowing beneath the golden light of a sun just beginning to rise. Lori opened her eyes slowly. The first thing she saw was his coat wrapped around her. The second was Thatcher, sleeping beside her on the wooden floor, one arm draped protectively across her body. His breathing was steady, his brow relaxed in a way she had never seen before. She stared at him for a long time, letting the quiet soak into her bones. "I don't want the land anymore," she whispered. Thatcher's eyes opened, calm and unreadable. "I want what grows on it," she said, voice steady now. "With you." They returned to the valley before noon. The snow had begun to melt in places, leaving the earth wet and dark, full of promise. Lori said little, but that evening she took a single box from her father's house and carried it to the Boone Ranch. The next day, another, a quilt, a jar of preserves, her father's tools. By the end of the week, her garden spade leaned next to his saddle. Her shawl hung beside his coat. Her breath joined his in the mornings by the same hearth. No one said the word move, but every creak in the floor, every shared meal, every cup passed from one hand to the other said it for them. One evening, when the fire had burned down low and the house was quiet, Thatcher stood from his chair and walked to a shelf above the mantel. He reached up and pulled down a small wooden box. Lori watched him in silence. He turned, walked back to her, and knelt down. "I've asked you before," he said, voice low. "With papers and contracts and everything a man can sign." He opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring, slightly uneven, clearly handmade. This time, no courthouse, no bargain, just this. He took her hand. "Will you be my wife?" he said, meeting her eyes, "not in name, not in contract, but in every sunrise after this one." Lori's breath caught. She looked down at the ring, then at the man who had built fences with his own hands, slept on floors beside her, and searched through snow to find her. She nodded. "Yes, in every sunrise." He slipped the ring on her finger. It fit, not perfectly, but just right. She leaned forward, pressed her forehead to his, and closed her eyes. There was no need for more words. The fire popped gently behind them, the wind outside had calmed. And inside that warm, quiet room, two people who had once signed a contract now held something far rarer. They had chosen each other. Again. This time, without conditions. The sun sat low over the golden fields, casting long shadows across the rows of ripe corn and wheat. The air smelled of earth and hay, crisp with the promise of autumn. Lori Boone stood in the center of the harvest, sleeves rolled to her elbows, voice carrying over the bustle of workers. She moved with purpose, calling instructions, guiding wagons, inspecting the crop, like a woman who had always belonged to this land. She did not pause to fix her hair when the wind caught it. She did not lower her eyes when the men looked to her for direction. Her boots were caked in soil, her palms were rough. But her face glowed, lit from within. From the edge of the field, Thatcher watched her. In his arms, a small boy bounced with delight, giggling as a horse trotted past. The boy had Thatcher's eyes and Lori's steady mouth, but the name he carried was that of a man he would never meet. "Say hi to your mama, Elias," Thatcher murmured, kissing the child's cheek. The workers called out, Mrs. Boone across the rows, asking questions, making jokes, sharing updates. And for the first time since the name had been given to her, Lori did not correct them. She did not flinch. She smiled. That evening, the entire ranch gathered in the barn lit with lanterns and lined with hay bales. Tables were laid out with stew and cornbread, fresh pies and cider. Music floated through the night as Thatcher strummed a weathered guitar, laughter rising with the rhythm of the chords. Lori stood near the back and read a poem. It was one her mother had taught her. Her voice carried strong and clear, and when she finished, the silence was soft and respectful before the barn erupted in applause. Later, When the noise faded and the stars came out, the couple sat side by side on the edge of the porch roof, legs swinging lazily over the side. The land stretched before them like a painting. Rows upon rows of grain shimmered under the full moon, still and endless. Lori leaned into Thatcher's shoulder and took a long breath. "I asked you to let me keep my home," she said. He turned toward her. "But you gave me one instead." He said nothing, just pulled her closer. She laid her hand over his, and in the quiet, Elias stirred in his cradle inside the house, letting out a small, contented sigh. The night held them all. And the voice of the story came, like a breeze over wheat. In a land claimed by paper and fences, theirs was claimed by choice, and this time, no one was leaving. If you made it this far, it means you stayed, just like Lori and Thatcher. Through the storms, the silence, the stubbornness, and the softening. You saw how a contract became a promise, how two strangers became a home, and how love grew not in a field of roses, but in soil rough and real. This isn't just a story about land, it's about the ground we stand on when everything else gives way, the quiet dignity of choosing someone, not because you must, but because your heart says stay. It's about that look across a field at sunset, that touch without words, that vow made not before a crowd but beside a stove or under a leaking roof. And if stories like this, stories of dusty roads, broken hearts made whole, and love built with calloused hands, speak to you, don't ride off just yet. Tap that hype button like it's a cowboy's hat flying in the wind. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories so you never miss another tale of fire,